I never expected grief to come with an audience, but the day of the funeral proved me wrong. The chapel was small, quiet, filled with people who knew my uncle as a reserved man who loved land more than conversation. He had owned those 900 acres for decades, working them, protecting them, refusing every offer that tried to turn soil into subdivisions. To me, he was family first, property owner second. That morning, I stood near the front, focused on keeping my composure, not on inheritance, not on paperwork, not on what would happen next. The service had barely begun when the tension crept in. It wasn't loud at first. It was a shift, the way air changes before a storm. I noticed heads turning, whispers traveling faster than respect should have allowed. Then I saw her, the HOA Karen. I didn't know her personally, but I knew her reputation. She lived in the gated community bordering my uncle's land, a woman who believed proximity meant entitlement. Her heels clicked too loudly on the chapel floor as she moved forward, ignoring the stunned looks around her. She didn't wait for the pastor to finish a sentence. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't acknowledge where she was. She pointed straight at me and shouted, "Where's the will?" The words echoed, sharp and ugly, slicing through grief like it didn't matter. Gasps filled the room. Someone tried to shush her. Someone else stood up, furious. I felt heat rush to my face, not embarrassment, but disbelief that anyone could think this was acceptable. I said nothing, not because I was weak, but because I understood something she didn't. This wasn't about grief for her. It was about control. She believed that if she challenged the inheritance publicly, loudly, she could create doubt. Doubt leads to delay. Delay creates opportunity. And opportunity, in her mind, meant access to land she'd wanted for years. My uncle had warned me about people like her. He used to say land attracts two kinds of neighbors, those who respect boundaries and those who test them. He had dealt with the HOA before. Complaints about fences. Complaints about dust. Complaints about views. Every time, he shut them down legally, quietly, permanently. He always told me, they don't stop because they're right. They stop because the law makes them. As she stood there, demanding answers she wasn't entitled to, I realized this moment was the opening act. She wasn't mourning a man. She was calculating leverage. And she had no idea how prepared my uncle had been, or how thoroughly he had ensured that when he was gone, nothing he built could be taken by noise, pressure, or intimidation. At that moment, standing in that chapel, I understood that the inheritance itself was only part of what had been passed down. The real legacy was preparation. Documents filed correctly. Boundaries surveyed precisely. Legal protections layered in place long before emotions could be exploited. My uncle had anticipated confrontation, and he had designed his estate to withstand it. While she saw an opportunity, I saw a plan unfolding exactly as intended, steady and unmovable. She broke the silence of a funeral, but she also revealed herself completely. And in doing so, she unknowingly stepped onto ground my uncle had fortified long ago. This was never going to be a loud battle. It was going to be a quiet one, decided by patience, records, and the kind of foresight that doesn't raise its voice. And that understanding settled in before the service even reached its final prayer that day. After the service ended, most people lingered quietly, sharing memories and condolences, but she didn't. The HOA Karen moved fast, like the funeral had been a formality she'd already checked off. By the time I stepped outside, she was already on her phone, pacing near the parking lot, speaking in sharp, clipped tones. I caught fragments as I passed: unclear ownership, no proof, community concern. She wasn't calling family. She wasn't calling a lawyer. She was calling people who thrived on confusion. Within 48 hours, the first letter arrived. It wasn't addressed to me personally, but to the estate of, as if refusing to acknowledge my name might somehow weaken my claim. The HOA was requesting documentation, citing concerns about boundary usage, access roads, and long-standing informal agreements. I almost smiled when I read that phrase. There is nothing informal about 900 acres when it's been surveyed, recorded, and taxed for decades. More letters followed. Emails. Notices slipped into my mailbox that looked official enough to worry someone unfamiliar with the process. They questioned the validity of the will without directly accusing anything. That was deliberate. Accusations require evidence. Questions only require confidence. And she had plenty of that. I finally attended my first HOA meeting, not because I was required to, but because I wanted to see how far this would go. The room was packed. Homeowners whispering. Board members pretending neutrality. And her, seated front and center, already smiling like the outcome was a foregone conclusion. She spoke at length about community needs, about how my uncle had been difficult, about how the land had always been intended for shared use. Intention, apparently, was now a substitute for law. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. I confirmed the inheritance. I confirmed the boundaries. I stated that any claims against the estate would need to be made through proper legal channels. No emotion. No insults. Just facts. The smile on her face didn't fade, but it tightened. She believed I was bluffing, that I didn't understand how exhausting prolonged disputes could be. What she didn't know was that my uncle had already endured years of this behavior. He had kept records of every complaint, every meeting, every threat disguised as concern. Boxes of neatly labeled files sat in his study, each one documenting an attempted overreach. He hadn't fought loudly. He'd fought methodically. And now those records belonged to me. The escalation came quickly after that meeting. The HOA began restricting access to a gravel road that cut through their subdivision, a road my uncle had legally used for decades. They claimed it was a temporary safety measure. I claimed it was interference. My attorney claimed it was a violation. That's when the tone changed. Polite questions became defensive statements. Friendly reminders turned into hurried emails marked urgent. Behind all of it was her voice, pushing, insisting, framing the narrative as a community versus an outsider, even though the land had been there long before the community ever existed. She believed momentum was on her side. She believed pressure would make me compromise. What she didn't see was that every move she made was being added to a growing file, one that didn't care how confident she sounded in a meeting room. This wasn't about whether the will existed. It did. This was about whether she could force doubt where none legally existed. And with every step she took, she was building the very case that would eventually dismantle her position entirely, brick by brick, document by document, without ever needing to raise my voice. By the third week, it was no longer subtle. The HOA stopped pretending this was about clarification and started acting like the land was already slipping through my fingers. Surveyors hired by the association appeared near the boundary fence without notice. When confronted, they claimed they were verifying historical usage, a phrase that sounded official but meant nothing without permission. I documented everything. Dates, times, names, photos. Every attempt to blur the line only made the line sharper. Then came the petition. Printed, circulated, and signed by dozens of homeowners who had never set foot on my uncle's land, yet felt comfortable claiming it had always been part of their community plan. They argued the acreage was underutilized, and that my inheritance created an opportunity for reevaluation. Reevaluation, in their language, meant redistribution. It was astonishing how easily grief became irrelevant once numbers were involved. At the next HOA meeting, she stood again, louder than before, waving copies of the petition as if volume added legitimacy. She spoke about fairness, about growth, about honoring the spirit of the community. Not once did she mention law. Not once did she acknowledge ownership. The board listened, nodding carefully, trapped between appeasing her and acknowledging reality. When she finished, she looked directly at me, confident, almost triumphant. I responded by placing a single folder on the table. Inside were certified copies of the will, probate filings, recorded surveys, easement maps, and decades of tax records. I didn't explain each document. I didn't argue. I simply stated that any further interference would be addressed legally, and that every action taken so far had already been documented. The room went quiet in a way that felt different. Not stunned. Calculating. That silence didn't stop her. It provoked her. Within days, Complaints were filed with the county about environmental concerns. Anonymous tips about improper land use. A claim that the ranch access road posed a safety hazard. Each complaint triggered inspections. Each inspection found nothing wrong. And each cleared report added another layer to the record she didn't realize was growing heavier by the day. The turning point came when she overreached. She contacted a distant relative of my uncle, someone barely connected, and suggested the will might be contestable. That conversation made its way back to me through an affidavit, signed and notarized. Encouraging a will challenge without evidence crossed a line from nuisance into liability. My attorney didn't hesitate. A formal cease and desist was drafted, citing harassment, interference, and bad faith actions. She laughed it off at first, said she was just asking questions, said the community deserved answers. But the tone shifted when her own attorney reviewed the documentation. The paper trail was no longer theoretical. It was undeniable. Patterns, timelines, intent. Everything she believed was pressure had become proof. By the end of that month, the HOA board called an emergency meeting without her. Notices went out quietly. Agendas were rewritten. When I arrived, her seat was empty. The board's attorney spoke instead, outlining risks, exposure, and consequences. The words were careful, but the message was clear. This had gone too far. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply listened as the situation corrected itself, the way systems sometimes do when evidence outweighs noise. She had shouted at a funeral, believing intimidation would secure her leverage. Instead, she had triggered a process she couldn't control, one grounded in records, restraint, and a will that had been written to endure exactly this kind of challenge. The consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived with emails, letters, and quiet shifts in tone that told the real story, without ever needing to say it out loud. The first message came from the HOA's attorney, not the board, and not her. It acknowledged receipt of the cease and desist and confirmed that all communication would now be routed through legal counsel. That alone spoke volumes. When people stop talking directly, it's because they've realized every word now matters. Access to the gravel road was restored without announcement. The temporary barriers vanished overnight, as if they'd never existed. No explanation. No apology. Just compliance. County inspectors stopped showing up. Complaints dried up completely. The machinery she'd set in motion began reversing itself, not because anyone admitted fault, but because continuing would only deepen the record already forming against them. Then the board acted. A special meeting was held, closed session, with minutes released later that said very little and revealed everything. A review of governance practices. A discussion of fiduciary responsibility. A vote to restructure certain committees. Her name appeared once, buried in neutral language, referenced only as a community representative whose actions exceeded authorized scope. That was the moment she lost her platform. Authority without a microphone fades fast. She didn't confront me again. Not in person. Not by letter. Not through intermediaries. The woman who had shouted in a chapel now avoided eye contact when paths crossed near the boundary fence. Confidence had drained out of her posture, replaced by the stiff caution of someone suddenly aware that consequences are real and traceable. Entitlement thrives in ambiguity. Documentation starves it. The final blow wasn't mine to deliver. It came from the insurance carrier. Once the pattern of behavior was reviewed, false claims, legal exposure, harassment, the HOA's policy was reevaluated. Premiums increased. Coverage exclusions were added. The board faced a choice: correct the problem or absorb the cost. Boards choose survival every time. Within weeks, she resigned from her position, citing personal reasons. The community announcement was polite, brief, and carefully worded. She didn't lose everything dramatically. No courtroom spectacle. No public shaming. She lost influence first. Then credibility. Then protection. The privileges she'd mistaken for rights disappeared quietly, one layer at a time, until all that remained was a private individual with no authority and a very clear legal history attached to her name. For me, life settled into something steady. Probate closed. The land transferred cleanly. Fences were repaired. Gates reinforced. I met with surveyors of my own, not because the boundaries were in doubt, but because clarity prevents future fiction. The acres stretched out exactly as they always had, indifferent to the drama they'd inspired. What struck me most was how predictable it all was in hindsight. She believed volume created power. She believed confrontation created leverage. She believed the absence of immediate resistance meant weakness. What she never accounted for was preparation, the kind that doesn't respond emotionally, doesn't escalate publicly, and doesn't deviate from process. My uncle had anticipated this type of person. Not her specifically, but the idea. Section 5. The day I inherited 900 acres was supposed to be about grief, not greed, but greed has a way of showing up early and loud. The funeral was held in a small country church with peeling white paint and folding chairs that had seen decades of sorrow. My grandfather had been a quiet man, the kind who fixed fences himself and never raised his voice. As I stood near the front, staring at the closed casket, I thought about summers spent writing fence lines with him, learning the land by heart. I didn't know then that the land had already decided my future. The service ended with polite murmurs and slow footsteps toward the exit. I stayed behind, answering soft condolences, when I heard heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. The sound didn't belong there. I turned and saw her for the first time, perfectly dressed, perfectly angry, eyes scanning the room like she owned it. People like her don't whisper at funerals. They project. She stopped 3 feet from me and crossed her arms. "So," she said, loud enough to draw attention, "where's the will?" The words hit harder than any eulogy. Conversations died around us. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Excuse me?" "The will," she repeated, tapping her manicured nails together. "Your grandfather promised the land would be handled properly. We need to see documentation."
We.
That word mattered. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood 2 men in press jackets and a woman clutching a leather folder. HOA representatives, though I didn't know it yet. They watched me the way predators watch injured prey, already calculating what pieces they wanted. "My grandfather hasn't even been buried yet," I said. "This isn't the time." She scoffed. "Time is exactly the issue. That land borders our development. We have plans, agreements, expectations." That was when the puzzle pieces started clicking together. The sudden interest. The aggressive confidence. I remembered my grandfather mentioning pressure, letters he never answered, people who thought land was just a number on paper. He'd always said, "They'll come when I'm gone." I just hadn't believed him. A few mourners shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen. The pastor cleared his throat but said nothing. I realized then that if I didn't draw a line now, I never would. "Any legal matters will be handled by the executor," I said. "Not here." Her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, honey, we know who the executor is. And we know the will hasn't been filed yet."
That chilled me.
They were already moving. Already confident. She leaned closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound threatening. "You should understand what you're inheriting before you try to keep it." I met her stare and felt something settle inside me. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was a test. "I understand exactly what I'm inheriting," I said. "And I suggest you step back." For a moment, she looked surprised, then annoyed. She straightened, turned on her heel, and walked out, her entourage following like obedient shadows. The church doors slammed shut behind them, echoing through the sanctuary. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing one thing with absolute certainty. My grandfather hadn't left me just land. He'd left me a fight, and it had already begun. I didn't know then how far they would go, or how much they would lose, but standing in that church, I finally understood why my grandfather had taught me to stand my ground when pressure comes and expects you to fold.